Everyone. Welcome to the session. My name is Barry. I'm actually the database solution architect from AWS. Today, I'll actually be presenting 3 ways that you can actually run SQL Server on AWS. Before we get started, I wanted to go through the agenda for the day. So we'll talk about what is the business drivers for cloud migration. And we'll move on to the 6 R's of migration. And then we'll touch base on what is the 3 ways that you can actually run SQL Server on AWS. We'll go into the technical bit, which is the migration strategies, what is out there, or what strategies you can actually use to actually migrate. And last but not least, we'll talk about how do you actually refactor SQL Server, which is one of the most interesting points. Right, so moving on, the first thing that I wanted to touch on is actually the business drivers for migrating to the cloud. So there's definitely a few points, and it could be more than what we have on the slide, but essentially what we have seen in AWS is the cloud in AWS actually provides you agility for you to actually deploy your application, right? There's also the cost factor that majority of people are looking at as well. So you move from capital expenditure to operating expenditure. There are some customers that thought about data consolidation. So obviously they actually wanted to consolidate or even retire their data center and move their application and servers to the cloud as well. One of the things which we find that there's a lot of customers that move to the cloud is because the availability of the services itself in the cloud. In this case, IoT related services and also AI ML, where you have managed services that is available in the cloud where you can actually leverage and start using, right, without really needing to provision, wait for hardware to arrive, rack them up, which takes months. So essentially, you can actually do this within a couple of hours or even sometimes minutes. Yeah. But the main 6 R's of migration to the cloud is essentially these ones that is on the screen right now. So we talk about retain, retire, replace, rehost, replatform, and refactor. But specifically, I'm going to touch specifically about SQL Server here, which is we are talking about rehost, and then we talk about replatform, and then also we talk about refactor. We'll definitely touch more about this later on in the upcoming slides. So hold on to that information. When we talk about why SQL Server on AWS, the main reason what I can see is the integration of the relational database services to its AWS services, where we provide the broadest and deepest capabilities that you can actually run. Right? We also reduce quite a fair bit of complexity of running database systems on AWS. And obviously, we want to lower your TCO. So with running of your SQL Server on AWS, you manage your sizing. You decide when is the right time to actually scale and scale back in. based on your workload. And then we provide also quite a flexible licensing options where you will be able to bring your own licenses if you have, or in this case, use the license included model as well. All right, so let's go to the interesting bit about the 3 ways of actually running SQL Server on AWS. And I'll definitely point it back to the 3 R's we spoke about previously. So let's talk about the 3 ways that you can actually run SQL Server on AWS. The first is actually to rehost. Rehost simply means here is lift and shift. So essentially, if you're running on a physical machine, or even if you're running on a VM, you would actually lift the entire machine into AWS. Right? So that's what we call as rehost. There are customers that do replatforming. So they actually move to manage, essentially because they wanted to be free from managing those servers, OS patches and whatnot. So they move to our managed service called RDS, or Relational Database Service. And then after a while, some customers may also think about refactoring. So as you may heard or you may come across, in AWS, there's a total of 15 purpose-built databases, and they are built for a reason. Right? So in this case, each database is catered for a specific workload. So we have things like NoSQL database for key-based or key pair type of workload. We have graph database, and also even relational itself. We provide a few flavors of open sources database, namely MySQL, Postgres. So in this case, there are customers who wanted to move away. So they moved to, let's say, an open source database, and which actually bring down their operational costs quite a fair bit. Right? In this case, 1/10 of the cost they used to spend on AWS or on SQL Server are now spent on open source itself. Right? So with that in mind, I'll give you a flavors of what is there. So on SQL Server workload on AWS, we actually have 2 flavors that we usually see customer running. So we call it as Amazon RDS, which is our managed service. So this is a service that allows you to actually scale and even size your particular workload or your servers up to the specs that you require. So in this case, you can have up to 128 vCPUs, up to 4 TB of RAM, and currently 16 TB of storage. Okay, and obviously, if your application requires a high IOPS throughput, then you have those provision IOPS disks that you can actually go up to 64,000 IOPS. In this particular offering, we also have Express Edition. We also provide Web Standard Enterprise Edition, and then I would like to also point out that depending on the editions that you are currently running, there are definitely recommended and available instance types that you can actually choose in this case. For customers that are sometimes running legacy applications or has a requirements for some specific type of workload, they do run on EC2. And then in this case, we will say it's actually a lift and shift. And when you say lift and shift, essentially you actually run on EC2, and then you provision the number of resources that you require. Right? In this case, you can go higher than what RDS provides if there's a requirements to do so. Right? And you have full capability in how you want to spec your service on EC2. You can go, example, EBS volume, you can go to our GP2 disk or general purpose disk, GP2. The newest one would be GP3, and then you have provision IOPS, or we call it as IO1, IO2, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a fair bit of choices in terms of EC2 itself. Right. With that understanding, I wanted to actually bring a point to this part of the deck where we talk about what is your responsibility over here in this case. So we have on the left side, we have Amazon RDS for SQL Server. So if you actually see the entire stack, right, from racking, from the power, from OS installation, patching, and whatnot, is actually managed by AWS. It helps, in this case, it helps you to actually alleviate the need for managing your server, and you leave the heavy lifting to us actually. For those that goes to EC2, the power, the OS installation, maintenance of the VM belongs to AWS, but anything above the OS level belongs to you. So it's your responsibility to actually do patching. It's your responsibility to think about your database backup strategy. It's your responsibility to also think about what kind of high availability options that you want to deploy into your entire architecture, and how do you want to scale should you need that scaling capability in future. All right, so I'm going to focus a bit more on RDS, or our managed service. So in this case, you have the option to actually deploy RDS in a multi-AZ environment. Multi-AZ means multiple availability zone. So this is actually to provide you high availability. So when you have a deployment into multi-AZ, you have your primary instance and what we call as a secondary instance. So secondary instance is definitely an instance where you don't access. So it remains secondary, or we call it as active passive. And it is actually synced across using synchronous commit, and it allows automatic failover. All right, and you know, if you are a DBA by nature, or if you're a DBA that has been working on creating a high availability environment, this is something you have been managing or trying to manage all this while. But with RDS, essentially this is a managed service, so this is actually taken away from your responsibility. You leave that managing of high availability across multiple AZs to us, right? So in the event, if you're having multiple AZ deployments, what happens in this case if there's a database failure, right? Should there be a database failure or an instance failure, an automatic failover will have taken place, and your applications will then have very minimal downtime. So like I say previously in the deck before, we cater for automatic failover. We also have synchronization replication as well. So to make sure that we minimize data loss as much as we can. And those that have experience deploying RDS on AWS, this is actually the one-click enablement. So when you provision your cluster, you just have to click that I wanted this to be a multi-AZ deployment, and then when you create your instance, essentially behind the scene, we will provision that multi-AZ deployment for you. Right? And for those that is in the know about SQL Server replication technology, or HA technology, behind the scene, we are actually leveraging Microsoft database mirroring, SQL Server database mirroring, or always on configuration, depending on the version of SQL Server that you're deploying right now. All right, so going through what we have done for RDS through the years, definitely in 2020, we made quite a fair bit of launches in this case. So for those that is using SQL Server, not just purely to host your database or a container for your data, and for those who are into BI, so right now, business intelligence. So right now, we actually have launched SSAS, or what we call as SQL Server Analysis Services, onto RDS. We have also launched SSIS. So those are the BI stack of SQL Server, and including SSRS as well. Right? We have also also launched the support for multi-file backup, so you can actually back up to multiple files, and there are definitely much more. So one of the important ones I wanted to point out is the introduction, or the launch of SQL Server 2019. In last year, so that's what we have done. So there's quite a fair bit, and there's actually a few more in the pipeline or in the roadmap that's coming out for launch coming this year or towards this year end. All right, so let me move on into something more related to how do you actually move your workload into AWS, or the migration strategies you can actually adopt moving your workload into AWS. So these are a few of those that is currently being used by majority of customers. It may not mean that it's the entire thing, but generally we work on SQL Server Backup Restore. We also talk about SQL Server replication as one of the options to actually migrate your data to AWS. For those who wanted to do a bit of, or already have been using always on availability group, you can actually expand your ability group to the cloud as well. And then we talk a bit about server rehost, and then last but not least, a migration tool which we call AWS MTMS itself. So let's start with the database backup and restore migration. Should you have a longer downtime that you can actually afford, so you can always take a backup and then transfer it into AWS and do a restore, either to RDS or to SQL Server on EC2. All right. You can also leverage some of our services that uses an agent to sync the data. So primarily, we are talking about storage gateway and also data sync here. So you'll be able to use these available tools to actually do a sync of your backup into AWS, potentially into S3, right? A bucket in S3. We can also leverage example here, FSX, to actually do migration as well into the cloud. And one of the things where we do see customer leveraging, especially if you're talking about multi-terabyte database, which is huge, and you don't have and you have network bandwidth limitation to actually migrate your data across. You can always use our services that allows you to actually transfer this data. So they are Snowcone, Snowball, or Snowmobile. Should you have huge amount of data which you want to transfer. So this is more like what I would categorize them as offline migration. So essentially, you transfer the backup files into one of these devices, which is attached to your local storage or your local environment. Once you have actually transferred that particular data into the device, you will get us to actually collect it, and we will actually restore it to S3. So once that is done, you will be able to actually transfer the file or actually restore it directly into RDS as well. All right, so this is definitely one of those migration methods that you can actually use. Well, we also have customers that are a bit more comfortable using their SQL Server native replication. So in this case, they use SQL Server transaction replication to actually replicate the data across into AWS. Most of the time, they will be leveraging the VPN connection that they have, or a direct connect connections that they have into AWS for a small, secure, and dedicated bandwidth example to migrate their data. So if you've been working with SQL Server a long time, you know that transactional replication have a few agents that works behind the scene. So you have a log reader agent that continuously read the transaction log files of changes that is currently happening on your on-prem SQL Server. And then there is a distribution agent in this case that will actually push the data across into AWS. So the subscribers in this case, so it's a pub sub kind of topology. So the subscriber in this case can be an EC2 instance, and it also can be an RDS instance in this case. Yeah. So this is one way where you can actually use to minimize downtime when you do a cutover. So transactional replication will allow continuous replication of data from on-prem into AWS. And when you're about to cut over, what you need to do is just break or stop the replication from happening, and then promote or change your connection string and point it to the databases in AWS. Like I say, if you have running instances that is already using always on availability group, you can also expand your availability group to the cloud by creating a secondary replica onto an EC2 instance. And then leveraging your connectivity into AWS. So in this case, because your corporate data center and AWS region could be far apart, so the recommendation in this case would be to use asynchronous commit so that it doesn't actually cause performance issues to your current running application on-prem. Right? Until you are ready to cut over, then you do a manual failover into AWS itself. Yeah, so that's definitely one way as well to actually minimize your downtime during cutover. But bear in mind, this is only to SQL Server on EC2. You can't really extend Ability Group to RDS instance. Right. Another thing where we also see happening is SQL Server rehost, which is lift and shift using a service where we call Cloud Engine. So what this service is essentially are agents that you install on your corporate data center, which reads all the changes that is currently happening at the block level. So it does block level replication into an environment in AWS. So this allows you to do a server rehost, so essentially running it on EC2 as well. So when you're ready to cut over, you can just do a cut over and bring up your application on AWS by maybe just changing the instance size to make sure that it is good enough for your production workload. All right. Another rehost option is SMS itself, so server migration service. So if you are running, example here would be VMware Hyper-V, or even running in Microsoft Azure VMs, you can actually leverage this service to actually do the migration for you. So essentially this service, what it does is it converts or incrementally converts your VMs into an AMI or Amazon Machine Image, which is a copy of your image file, and essentially you can use an AMI to actually launch EC2 instances during cutover time. Right, so these are multiple ways I would say to allow you to actually do a server rehost into AWS. Right, now let's talk a bit about something that is proprietary to AWS, the service called AWS DMS or Database Migration Service. Okay, so let's say example, you're running SQL Server Web Edition, which you may not have all those native capabilities to actually use to migrate the database to AWS. You can definitely, one of the things that you can actually do is definitely use DMS to actually do the migration for you, right, in this case. So what it does is you can actually deploy a replication instance, that's what we call. All right, and in this replication instance, what you can actually do is you can connect to your source and also to your target database. And then with that, you'll be able to actually select the schemas, the table, the database that you wanted to migrate. And then what happens is DMS will actually automatically create the tables for you and the schema for you onto your target instance, and you'll be able to actually load data incrementally from your on-premise into AWS, and it keeps on running. So this helps with the minimizing of your downtime when you actually do the migration itself. All right. The last point that I wanted to actually touch base on is once you have actually moved your workload to AWS, or in certain sense, there are customers who wanted to move away from SQL Server. That's where we talk about refactoring. So essentially, as you know, when we run commercial databases, they tend to be a bit costly, right? And then they are proprietary, obviously, and then there are lock-in periods that you have to, follow, and also a lot of licensing cost, right? That comes with it as well. So that's one of the main drivers to actually has actually prompted our customers to move away into more an open source database. So in this case, customers move primarily for a few reasons, and one of the reasons is actually to reduce cost, licensing costs essentially, and then it also allows you to increase your agility, right? Because you're working with a more cloud native environment, and also from a performance and scale, open source database is actually pretty capable in the sense to give you the performance and the scaling mechanism that you need. All right, so these are the main primary reasons why people are moving from open source, from commercial into open source databases. So the question now comes is, what tools do I have to actually do this migration? There are a couple of tools. So I mentioned DMS before, but it's something that I have not mentioned is actually called AWS Schema Conversion Tool. All right, so let me just go through and refresh the mind. So DMS allows you to actually move your database to open source targets. In this case, it could be MySQL, it could be Postgres, it could be MariaDB as well. All right, and should you want to move to a cloud native database, example, Amazon Aurora, or even Redshift, moving data warehouses to Redshift. So those are supported as well. Now, those are moving data. So right now, when we talk about the schema itself, there's a lot of question mark, I'm sure right now that you have. So how about my schema? So schema conversion tool, as the name applies, is a tool that allows you to actually do an analysis on your current schemas and code to actually allow you to look at the effort required to actually do the migration. So with this tool, all you need to do is connect to your source, database, and also to your target database, and run the tool. So essentially, the tool will give you a report to tell you what are the things that could be converted automatically if there's a one-to-one conversion method. If not, then it will propose alternative as well. And those that doesn't really have a option in your target database, it will potentially flag those out as well, so that you can actually take a manual effort in actually do the migration itself. So SCT integrates with DMS, so they work together to actually allow you to do schema conversion and also database migration at the same time, right? And then obviously, when we talk about conversion, so once you move, for example, to an open source database, and here in the deck it says Aurora PostgreSQL, right? And then there are definitely a lot of questions around what happens to my application code. Right? So my application code has been written in .NET, example, and it's been using SQL Server client driver, and using TDS as the protocol. So what happens to the code? There's a lot of work that has to be done to actually convert those application level code, right, to make sure that it's compatible to Postgres. So there's a particular feature which we name it as Babelfish, which is currently in preview, that allows that understands T-SQL code and does the conversion into Postgres code. And so that actually helps with the migration effort itself, because essentially once you migrate your schema into Aurora, your application code could depend on Babelfish for the translation. So you don't, it helps to definitely lower down the amount of effort and also work required to actually convert those code to a code that is understood by Postgres, or even compatible to Postgres itself. All right, so let's call out a few customers' references here, which has actually moved their workload or actually has innovated on AWS that leverages not only our database service, but generally the entire services that we have available in AWS itself. So the first one to call out is Allium Healthcare. They are actually a healthcare provider, and their main emphasis is actually the elderly in Singapore. So anyone that is above 65, they wanted to actually create an application that would allow their customers to be able to personalize their requirements of preference. In this case, they'll be able to actually, provide a better care for them in this case. So what they have done is they have actually leveraged the AWS technology or services in particularly EC2 and SQL Server on RES. To actually build this particular application that allows them to go to market faster and also to actually expand their business, at a rapid pace. So with these particular two technologies, they are able to actually, go to market pretty much faster than what they would anticipate. Another one that I wanted to call out is Enkit. So Enkit is actually based in Vietnam. They are majority in the indoor playground business, where they have visitors with children that uses mobile application or NFC cards to actually do payments and check in and check out in the playground itself. So what happens in this case is they used to have on-premise systems, and it crashes quite a fair bit during peak hours, which they have seen especially during school holidays and weekends. So they see that their systems right now on-prem is not able to actually cater the need, so they are not able to scale and be agile. So what they have done is they have actually moved to the cloud, leveraging AWS and using AWS Elastic Beanstalk, running their .NET application on Windows. So with that, they hardly had any issues with scaling anymore, because they are able to leverage the scalability options that we have on AWS to actually scale the application to cater for the load. And then obviously behind the scene, they are actually leveraging SQL Server. So that helps with minimizing the maintenance effort, the management effort that they do require back those days when they were running their servers on-prem to actually scale their SQL Server. So this allows them to actually focus on their business and actually to do much more than what they can do previously. So it helps with their business growth as well. All right. So actually, it's time for Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, do feel free to type it in. We're more than happy to actually answer the questions for you. All right. If for those who wanted to know a bit more about training and certifications, definitely there are ways for you to actually find out how to actually accelerate your migrations with digital training courses that we have, classroom trainings as well, and also certifications just to embark your journey into the cloud. There are also free virtual AWS classes that you can join, and you can also now take certifications online should you need to do a certification on AWS as well. For those that needs a bit more information about the migration initiative, you can always visit the Migration Hub, in this case the Resource Hub, to actually start looking at these resources to help you in your migration journey. And I believe this particular session will also be uploaded into the Resource Hub for your reference as well. With that, I would